We're in this series based on that T.S. Eliot poem we just heard, thinking about life lived between two waves of the sea. How do we hear God's voice even when it feels like we're stuck, when we're caught between two waves of the sea? And we've talked about a few ways to hear God's voice. And we want to invite you, if you're interested, we're going to be holding a class over the next 3 weeks here at the 9:45 service on hearing God. And it's a book by Dallas Willard. You don't have to read the book, no pressure, but it'll be taught by my parents, Dan and Lori Speak, and to give them some accreditation, they're not just my parents, okay? That's not their only authority. He's a professor of philosophy at Loyola Marymount. She has MDiv from Fuller Seminary and is an attorney now. So they do know a thing or two about this. I haven't just picked two random authority figures in my life to teach this class, but we'd love to invite you to be a part of it. You can find more info. There's some cards in the lobby on the way out as you head out if you're interested in it, if you're not signed up already at this point as well. And it's totally free, just so you know. But today, as Sandra said so well, we are celebrating the moms in our lives, our moms, our grandmas, the moms of our kids and our grandkids. And at the same time, we are grieving with those who are here this morning who've lost their moms. We mourn with those who want to be moms but aren't yet. We are sitting with the moms who are moms in very difficult circumstances right now. And Mother's Day is a joyful day for many of us. It's a mournful day for some of us. It's a confusing day for some of us, all in different ways for different people. And while we're not going to spend this morning talking about Mother's Day, I do think that there's something in this morning for all of us to think about, that it's applicable to all of us, but especially for moms as well. And this morning, what we're going to think about is rest. We're going to think about, how do we build rest? How do we build a rhythm of rest in our lives to hear God's voice even when we're caught between two waves of the sea? And rest is challenging for a lot of us, I think. Even as you're sitting here, you probably have thoughts popping into your head about things that you need to do at this point. You've got to clean the house before the week gets started. You have to go grocery shopping to get all the meals prepped. You have to put away the piles of laundry, or at least wash the piles of laundry, right? Then it's good. If it's just a clean pile of laundry, it's okay. But you have to have clothes ready for tomorrow. There's all sorts of things to be done. You have your mind on meetings you'll be having at work this week, the assignments that you have due at school, the dinner you're supposed to spend with your family that you're not really looking forward to. Your calendar is filled. Your to-do list is just uncompleted check boxes. Your bedtime keeps getting pushed back and your morning alarm pushed forward every single day. And at the same time, you're wanting to think about to have some sort of encounter with God in the midst of it all. Right? The reality is, though, that your life might be too busy to hear God's voice. Your life might be too busy to hear God's voice right now. We want to have the encounters with God that people had with God in Scripture. We want to experience God the way that Elijah and Gideon experienced God. We want to hear God's voice in the powerful and profound ways that we think would leave us without doubt or worry or anxiety. But we don't have the time in our lives to hear him, to listen for him. And Jesus serves as a great example for us, I think, because throughout the Gospels in Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, we see Jesus left time in his life to listen. And this morning, we're going to be looking at one of these moments in Luke chapter 9, if you want to open up there, starting in verse 28. And it's a story that's known as the Transfiguration. And the event is referenced by Matthew and Mark and Luke in their Gospels. And in all three of them, it serves a significant sort of literary moment in all three Gospels. It's this big turning point moment in all three Gospels. All three Gospel writers here think of this moment as a sort of pinnacle, as the high point, the climax of Jesus' ministry in their own ways. And this morning, we get to think about how this moment came to be and what it has to teach us about building rhythms of rest. So Luke chapter 9, starting in verse 28, says this. About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. Two men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men standing with him. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what he was saying. While he was speaking, a cloud appeared and covered them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. The disciples kept this to themselves and did not tell anyone at that time what they had seen. Here's this incredible moment where Peter and James and John, they had this powerful encounter with Jesus, seeing Jesus before them in all of his glory with Moses and Elijah right there. And it all started because Jesus built a rhythm of rest in his life and in the lives of his disciples. Jesus took these 3 disciples up the mountain to pray with him, to join him in his time of prayer, away from the crowds, away from the to-do lists, away from the busy schedules choking out their days. And he didn't just do it here in Luke 9, right? This isn't a one-off thing. I set out the task of I was going to go through the Gospels and keep a tally mark of all the times that Jesus went off on his own to pray and to rest. And I got a third of the way through Mark before I decided I was just going to say a lot of times, okay? It's a lot of times that Jesus throughout the Gospels goes away. He spends this time away in prayer, in moments of rest. And in all those times, Jesus modeled for us the way for us to build a rhythm of rest with God. Jesus modeled for us the importance to build a rhythm of rest with God. If we want to hear God's voice, especially if we want to hear God's voice when we feel like we're trapped between 2 waves of the sea, we have to build a consistent rhythm of rest in our lives. Of real rest, of rest with God. And the Transfiguration gives us a guide for how, at least in a way, to build this rhythm, or at least how to start. And this is really cheesy. It's cheesy, so we're just gonna go for it. And then I think that the rhythm that we can build in this, it's as easy as stop, drop, and go, okay? It's like stop, drop, and roll. Yeah, okay. So stop, drop, and go. And for us, a rhythm of rest with God starts by stopping. A rhythm of rest with God starts by stopping. You can't do everything in life, and you shouldn't do everything in life. Your time on earth is limited. And I'm sorry if that bursts anyone's sort of bubble about their limited existence on this, but the reality is that our time is limited here. And you don't have enough time for everything. We all want to cram 36 hours worth of stuff into a 24-hour day. There's the gym and 3 meals and time with our friends and time with our spouse and watching TV and reading the Bible and praying and dessert and playing with kids and starting a new book and taking the kids to their practices and taking them to their games and taking them to their events and seeing the movie that just came out and running the race that we want to run. And it's just too much. You can't do everything. And you shouldn't do everything. Jesus didn't even do everything. And this can be uncomfortable for us. It can be uncomfortable to think about at times because when we see is that for every person that Jesus healed in the Gospels, there's people that he didn't. For every person that Jesus cast a demon out of, there's people that he didn't. For every 5,000 people that Jesus fed, there's people that he didn't. And I can't tell you why he chose the people he did. I can't tell you why he performed the miracles he did, but I can tell you that he had to choose. And Jesus didn't do everything. And so what makes you think that you can? If God incarnate, God himself in the flesh, didn't complete every task, didn't have every meeting, didn't go to every event, then why do you expect that for yourself? Why do you expect that for your kids? Why do you expect that for your coworkers, for your friends, for other people in your life? Our pride tells us that it all rests on us, right? Our pride tells us that if we stop at any moment, the whole house of cards that is our lives will come crashing down. Our pride tells us that if we stop for even just a second, the waves surrounding us will crash over us and they will leave us drowning. And I'm sure that that's the pride that Peter and James and John were feeling when they went up on this mountain with Jesus. Jesus had just sent the 12 disciples out to proclaim the good news. Just before this, in this chapter, he sends the 12 out to proclaim the good news, to perform all sorts of miracles, and so they go out and they do just that. They do all sorts of incredible things. They're performing miracles. They're healing people. They're preaching the good news of the kingdom of God. It's this big moment. They had to feel like a big deal, like it all relied on them. Then they all came back together, and in that moment, Jesus performed the miracle of feeding the 5,000 people, or over 5,000 people, with the 5 loaves of bread and the 2 fish that the disciples had gathered from someone in the crowd. And they stood there between the people who had very real needs and between Jesus and the miraculous provision that he had for them, and they had to feel important standing in that place. Handing out the bread, handing out the fish, knowing that they were here with Jesus in this moment. They had to feel important. They had to feel like they were caught up in this chaos. And yet it's in this chaos and in this importance that Jesus took them away from the crowds and Jesus took them up the mountain. It's in the midst of the chaos. It's in the midst of the importance. It's in the midst of being caught up in what's going on around them that Jesus made them stop. You can think of your life maybe like a wagon for a second, and you're pulling it up this mountain. And you're taking the wagon up the mountain, and Jesus stops you, and he gives you something to take up with you. It's a package of some sort, and he puts it on the wagon. And you carry it along the way. And people see you carrying this wagon behind you, and they start to add other things to it, right? They see where you're going. A friend comes, and they leave their package on the wagon. A coworker places their burden on the wagon. Your spouse places, your kids, your teachers, your boss. Over and over again, people start to add more and more to the wagon. And eventually, as you're carrying it up the mountain, you get to a point where it becomes too heavy for you. The burden becomes too great for you, and you're left kind of wondering, why is this so heavy? Why is this burden in my life so great? And the truth is, it isn't not because the thing that Jesus asked you to take up the mountain is exceptionally heavy, but because everything else is. The extra hours at work hoping for that promotion, the extra coaching sessions for your kids to excel at their sports, the extra clients for the extra income to pay for the extra thing you want becomes heavy. And it isn't the thing that Jesus had called you to in the first place. The solution for us isn't to do more, it's to stop and do the right thing. To listen for God, as we talked about a few weeks ago, to do what he's called us to do and to listen again. John Mark Comer is a pastor and author in Portland, Oregon, and he put it this way. He said that the solution to an overbusy life is not more time. It's to slow down and simplify our lives around what really matters. You're not getting more time in your day. All of us, we're all pretty much locked into the time that we have in the day. And the solution to our over-busy lives is to stop. It's to stop and to focus on the right things, to practice that listen rhythm that we've talked about, to do the things that God has called us to do, and to be willing to let go of the things that he hasn't. To let go of the things that he hasn't called us to do, and yet we find ourselves doing over and over again, which is the whole point of this next step, to drop. Jesus took Peter and James and John up to that mountain to pray. Their moment of rest was with God. It was time spent with God, designed to be time to listen for God and to hear what God had for them. They had to literally drop to their knees and pray in this moment. And stopping reminds us that everything doesn't depend on us. As much as our pride might tell us it does, as much as the world might tell us it does, as much as the people around us might tell us it does, the reality is that stopping reminds us that it doesn't depend on us. Everything depends on God. And it's in prayer that we're reminded that it's God who we really depend on. Soren Kierkegaard was a Danish philosopher and a theologian of sorts, though he'd probably be upset about that title for himself. But he said this once. He said, "The function of prayer is not to influence God, but rather to change the nature of the one who prays." And your views on prayer aside there, I think there's a lot of truth in that statement, that for us, prayer and time in prayer is a consistent reminder that even though God has entrusted his work here on earth to us, it doesn't depend on us. It still depends on him. And I learned this the hard way as we prepared for the Rise conference a couple months back. And we had about 130 high school students who were registered for the conference from 4 churches, and we'd booked an awesome speaker, and we had everything planned out the way that we wanted it to be for what we thought was gonna be a great weekend of ministry. And Friday night of the conference went great. It was amazing. I was there. I thought it was everything went according to plan. Everything was a little too easy. Everything just went perfectly. And until we got a text from my parents that my son Jude might have the stomach flu, that he was throwing up at home. And so we drove home that night after cleaning up a bit, and we got home, and he was sitting on the couch with that kind of sad look that everyone gets right after they throw up, right? Just kind of staring off into space. And we talked to him for a little bit, carried him up to his room, laid him down, and I laid down with him. And about 3 hours later, Jude was no longer the only person with the stomach flu in the house, right? And I joined him very quickly in that moment. And so I was stuck at home. I missed Saturday, I missed Sunday of this huge moment, and all I could do was pray. I watched the chapels on a live stream, thanks to Alex. I prayed for the students, I prayed for the leaders, I prayed for the band, I prayed for our speaker, and everything went as planned. In fact, actually probably everything went better than as planned, which was especially gut-wrenching in a way, right? And so, but in all that prayer, what I got from God, what God so reminded me of, what God so clearly reminded me of was that it wasn't about me. It didn't depend on me. I built up this whole event, this whole plan, this whole grand scheme, and in the end, I really had no part in it. And that was okay. It would go on just fine. All I could do was drop everything in that moment and depend on God. Now, this doesn't mean that you need to go on your Aaron Rodgers-esque darkness retreat, right? You don't need to go spend 5 days in darkness to decide your next career or whatever it is that you feel like God might be calling you to. I don't think that that's necessary. I'm not asking you to stop filling your calendar with 30 different things and start filling your calendar with 30 hours of prayer and solitude, okay? That's not what I'm asking you to do. But I am asking you to think about how can you make time with God part of your rhythm of rest? How can you follow Jesus' example and the disciples' example to stop at various points in your life? To be willing to actually stop doing the things that you're doing, to drop and spend this time with God. Maybe it's a continuation of doing the fundamentals we've talked about the past week, of thinking about soap. Maybe it's a new practice, like actually going away at some point in time and spending time in prayer, spending time thinking about what God has for you. I don't know what it looks like for you. And depending on where you're at in life, it's going to look wildly different. But you have to have something. You have to have something to remind you that it doesn't all depend on you. You have to have something to remind you what God has called you to and what God hasn't called you to. You have to have something to remind you that God wants to be with you, not just for you to do things for him, but that you can be with him in these moments. But you can't just live at this point forever. You can't just live in the stopping and the dropping forever, because a time comes when we have to go. We all will have to go. And there's this amazing moment in the story of the Transfiguration where Peter got caught up in the moment, right? He's so struck by Jesus and all of his glory. He's so struck by seeing Moses and Elijah there. In verse 33, what's his suggestion? He says, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Right, this is an incredible moment. Peter has this moment. He went up to the mountain to pray. He sees Jesus in all of his glory. He sees these 2 prophets of the faith. He's overwhelmed in this moment, and he doesn't want to leave. And I can understand that, right? I can get that. I can feel what Peter was feeling. This is incredible. Why would he want to go? It's no surprise that he wants to stay there. But then everyone just ignores him. Right? No, he doesn't even get a response in this moment. Talk about feeling like a third wheel or whatever number wheel this is. Peter finally worked up the courage in this moment to interrupt Jesus and Moses and Elijah, to say something to these 3 people, to these 3 figures in this moment. And what happens? They ignore him. He doesn't even get a response, right? It says, in fact, that in verse 34, while he was speaking, a cloud appeared and covered them. God just butts in this moment. He blows right through whatever Peter's about to say. And then the cloud goes away after it speaks, and then all of them walk down the mountain together, right back to the chaotic life that was waiting for them. They're confronted with the chaos. And the very next page for me, it's literally a page over. It's the perfect page turn. There's a boy waiting for them who needs a demon cast out of him, and Jesus does it. The chaos is right there waiting. There's teaching for Jesus to do the moment they get down the mountain. The time for rest had passed in this moment, and the time for action had come. And our temptation, I think, can be to act just like Peter. To experience, maybe even experience God in our rest and to want to stay resting forever. But we can't do that. We have to go back to life. As far back as the 3rd century, Christians have been drawn away from life in the world, drawn into a sort of private faith. And Christians, we started building these monastic communities starting around then, of communities of monks and nuns and priests that were dedicated to studying scripture together, praying together, worshiping together, serving one another. And they were beautiful things in a way, beautiful communities in a way. But these communities also began to find themselves hidden behind what were called cloisters. And it's an architectural structure. It's like a square with columns around it. If you've ever visited one of the missions here in California, you've probably seen them with a fountain and a courtyard in the middle. And what ended up happening was that all the religious folk were hidden away inside this cloister, kept safe from the outside world, tucked away in their own little space, in their own little community, in their own little place, safe from the distractions of the outside world, where they could, the idea being, rest with God, always. Now, my guess is that very few of you are thinking about beginning a cloistered life in a monastery anytime soon. But my guess is that a lot more of us, at least more than a few of us, wouldn't mind a life that's turned inward. A life that is lived within the safety of walls that kept the chaotic world outside away from us. A life that allowed us to rest and do nothing else. Except God hasn't called us to that life. God has called us to go. Jesus' last instruction to his disciples after the resurrection was literally to go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. Right? The last instruction is to go. This is part of the challenge for us, I think, is that we want God to take us out of the waves of the sea. We want God to take us out of the place we find ourselves in. We want God to take us out of the circumstances that feel like they're making us drown. And then once we're out, then we will rest. Then we will build a rhythm of rest. But we've got to get out first. And yet what Jesus modeled for us is different. Jesus modeled a picture of stopping in the midst of the chaos, of dropping to rely on God, to rest with him, and then going right back into the world, right back into the chaos, right back into life. Which is why I want to challenge you to a really practical response this week, I think, a practical response to start planning next month's calendar. Now, I say next month's calendar because my guess is that it's May 14th today. For a lot of us, May is a wash at this point, right? There's no changing the next 2 weeks of May. Thank you, yeah. That's locked in. If you don't have May planned, start now, go for it. More power to you. But most of us, we're locked in at this point. So start with June. Start thinking about what June looks like and how could you plan June with this rhythm in mind? How could you plan June's calendar with the mindset that in June you're going to stop, you're going to drop, and you're going to go in order to hear God's voice even as you're caught between two waves of the sea? What is it that you need to say no to in June? What is it that needs to come off the calendar in June? Where are you going to schedule that time with God? Where are you going to put the time set aside to go to the people on your 8 to 15, to your coworkers, to your friends, to your classmates? How can you plan next month's calendar with a vision for building this rhythm in your life? Bill has this metaphor that he uses quite often, and I'm going to use it and give him credit for it. But while he's on a sabbatical, we'll give him credit, and when he comes back, we'll return to making fun of him. But he has this metaphor that I think is really helpful, and to think about. You can imagine a bucket, and you're filling a bucket with rocks and sand, these big rocks and sand. And if you pour the sand in first, and then try to fit the big rocks in, it's not going to fit. You fill the bucket with sand, there's no way for you to shove the big rocks in. But if you start with the big rocks first, you pour the sand in over the top, what ends up happening is that the sand finds its way down between the cracks and the bucket is filled up. And realistically, there's going to be sand that can't make it in, right? It's not going to fit perfectly. There will be sand that doesn't make it in. But that means that what doesn't make it in is sand, not the big rocks that you wanted in there in the first place. As we think about our own schedules, as we think about our own calendar, I challenge you, start with the big rocks of your life. What are the big rocks for the month of June that you want to see in there? That you want to make sure, I want to make sure I have time to stop in this month, so this has to go in first. I want to make sure that there's time for me to drop to be with God in this month, so that has to go in first. I want to make sure that there's time for me to go, so that has to go in first, and then fill the rest in after that. You can do it as a family, you can do it together. I don't recommend coming to the dinner table and telling your kids, right? Like, hey, you have to stop doing oboe lessons because I need to do something else with my time, okay? Don't just force this on them. Invite them into the conversation. Have them be a part of it. Have your spouse be a part of it. What does it look like to build this rhythm, not just by yourself, but as a family together? to build a rhythm where we say we're going to stop, we're going to drop, we're going to go, so that we have a rhythm in our lives to rest, to hear God's voice calling out to us even in the midst of the chaos. And this morning, we're going to do just that in a way. We're going to spend a moment together sharing communion. And the beauty of this moment is that communion is an opportunity for us to practice doing just this in a very short way. To practice actually stopping, to practice actually dropping in prayer to Jesus, to practice actually in a moment going out into the world together. To be reminded of the sacrifice that Jesus made for us, the offer that Jesus provided us, the life and the rest that he promises us. And to come in this moment and stop. Maybe you have to stop your mind for a second. Maybe your mind is racing already to the things that have to get done today, and you need to stop. Maybe there's something you need to come to Jesus about right now, to pray to him, to offer to him. And now's the moment to do that. Maybe you don't know where God has called you to go. And this is the moment to say, Jesus, I'm here in your presence. Make clear to me where I'm supposed to go in this moment. And so when you're ready, you can eat and drink and remember him, and we'll worship together.